Hello, everyone. My name is Jelena Kovacevic, and I'm a project researcher at MCIS Language Solutions. These webinar sessions serve as a complementary component to a mind training initiative to support senior victims of crime. Free online training program, resources, tips, and tools to assist service providers working with senior victims of crime. Before we proceed, I would like to acknowledge the support of the Government of Ontario, who is the funder of the online training initiative to support senior victims of crime, and MCIS Language Solutions, who have developed the project. So let's begin. Today's webinar is Violence Across the Lifespan, a snapshot of gender-based violence in older women in Ontario. Older women often describe feeling invisible within services, systems, and communities. After experiencing multiple forms of violence, often throughout generations and by multiple perpetrators, their needs for service and support are unique and complex. Ensuring the lifespan approach in your work with gender-based violence survivors can help to disrupt this invisibility and isolation older women and gender-diverse individuals may feel. Compared to younger survivors, older women are often less likely to report gender-based violence, have unique risk factors related to lethality and escalation of violence, and experience additional barriers to accessing support. Femicide rates against older women are on the rise, and the pandemic has resulted in new and increased challenges for service providers and community members providing support, service, and care. This interactive workshop will include an overview of gender-based violence against older women, language best practices, understanding and mitigating unique barriers for older women, tips on recognizing and responding to signs of high risk of lethality and harm, an overview of OAF's resources, training tools, tips, and knowledge focused on increasing capacity to provide trauma-informed service and support for older women who have experienced violence. The overall focus of this workshop is providing strategies for service providers to effectively recognize and respond to concerns an older woman is experiencing some form of abuse or violence. Our speaker today is Amber Wardell. She is the Communications and Resource Coordinator for the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses, OIF. Amber has worked for over 15 years as a community educator, coordinator, advocate, and counselor for survivors of gender-based violence in rural communities. As coordinator of OIF's Aging Without Violence project between 2018 and 2020, Amber assisted in developing new tools and resources focused on ending violence against older women in Ontario. OIF is a coalition of first-stage emergency women's shelters, second-stage housing organizations, and community-based women organizations who work towards ending violence against all women. Welcome, Amber. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. It's afternoon for me, but it might be a different time for some of our viewers. So I'll get started. I'd like to start off and acknowledge, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, the many territories of Turtle Island, Canada, on which we work and reside. These territories, ceded and unceded, are home to many Indigenous peoples who have lived here for tens of thousands of years and continue to live here. As settlers, immigrants, and descendants, and as visitors, we honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples of this land and territory and hope for a more just future together as a treaty people. I have up here just a small roadmap of the presentation today, let you know where we're going and the information that will be shared. I will provide a little bit of an overview of myself as a presenter. You heard a little bit of my bio there. And we'll talk about language. Some of that is promising practices and some more so established best practices. And there are unique barriers for older women. We'll review that, as well as high risk factors in relation to femicide. And I'd like to leave you with some action items to really respond in a concrete way in whatever work, whatever role that you're coming to us with today. And I'd love to link you up with some tools and resources that are available for anyone that's working with older women who may have experienced gender-based violence. So a little bit as my presenter overview. I am settler identified. I am a mom. I primarily have had my work experience be in the violence against women sector, but I have worked in other sectors and have a good understanding of, the work of different types of social services, especially. And I am within my role at OAIF, we're very focused on training and education. So you can see training.oaif.ca is up on the right in our logo there. And we do run a training hub, which is available to members of the public. And I'll highlight a few resources today that are available on our website separate from the training hub. And we also run a resource library. So those are all pieces that I can definitely assist with if you have any questions following up after the presentation. And I will share my contact information on my last slide. Just moving on and talking a little bit about language. Often the terminology that you'll hear is violence against women, VAW, or gender-based violence. I think gender-based violence is more inclusive, as it has more room for trans, non-binary, non-gender conforming, gender diverse, however that's kind of identified. So that language you might see more so reflecting services or experiences or a whole sector. So the violence against women, gender-based violence might include physical abuse, sexual abuse, might be emotional, verbal, psychological. Those do have overlapping aspects. Sometimes they are individualized. Financial abuse, sometimes called economic abuse, spiritual abuse, and coercive control. It's not within the scope of this presentation to go into the details of all of those types of abuse. What I will say is that often gender-based violence is only associated, especially when we look at research with the general public, with physical and sometimes sexual abuse. And there is sometimes a sense that if there isn't bruising or there isn't physical harm or the threat of physical harm, that there's not a severe impact to that abuse. And that's not the case. And we know that's not the case, especially for older women, because as they age and their whole lives, might be experiencing different types of abuse, different perpetrators throughout their life, we know that that abuse and the impacts are compounded over time. You can see here perpetrators might include family members, for older women, especially caregivers, spouses, partners, ex-partners, neighbors, acquaintances, service providers. For older women, that might also include other residents of, for example, a long-term care facility. When a survivor is older, and what I mean by older within our scope of research and within our work is really 55 and older, which some might find is an arbitrary number. And we do sometimes also talk about what's happening with 50 to 55. But generally, we find that 55 and older is a framework that's helpful for us. So whenever I say older throughout this presentation, that's specifically what I'm referring to. When someone is older, that might be called elder abuse. However, we find that the language of gender-based violence is more helpful than perhaps the silo of elder abuse, family abuse, might be called intergenerational trauma, domestic violence, intimate partner violence. And part of the limitations with some of that terminology is that it assumes a certain type of relationship, which we know might not be the case. And when we talk about the violence against women and gender-based violence sector, and I will give you a few links to resources within that sector at the end of this presentation. That includes emergency women's shelters, sexual assault centers, transitional housing, as well as community and school-based programming. That might include counseling that's in the actual community. It might include counseling where someone goes and attends that counseling in person or via a virtual service, even if they're not staying in a shelter. And typically these services are available to women of all ages. It might be that the shelter service is available only to women and children of certain ages, however. For example, that a child wouldn't be able to admit themselves to a women's shelter without a parent. And that would include trans women and non-cisgender women. And sorry, I shouldn't say parent, I should say without a caregiver. That would be the primary person who is being admitted to the shelter in my previous example. So just a few terms down at the bottom here. We do use the language of survivor, and that language is trauma-informed and it's survivor-centered. That's language that folks who have experienced gender-based violence have told us is helpful for them. We do use the terminology of victims sometimes, but that would be in circumstances where they were, their lives were ended as a result of the gender-based violence, and they are no longer, they did not survive the violence. So that would be when we use that victim language. There's also promising practice of using the language of aggressor. Some of that has been identified as helpful by Women at the Center, a survivor-led organization in Ontario. An aggressor might refer to someone who has perpetrated violence, who has harmed, who has unsafe behaviors in relationships of those different types that we've noted above. And that aggressor language used to be called, sometimes we use the language of abuser or, even batterer, looking at a long time ago. So looking at language that might be reflective to what people are using and finding helpful in the community is always great. So for us, we've recently started using aggressor. The lifespan approach, so a little bit more established. That idea of whatever's happening throughout your life all accumulates and it impacts what happens later in life, what's happened earlier in life. So looking at intimate partner violence, that might mean that if someone, looking at gender-based violence, that might mean that if someone experienced violence from an intimate partner early on in life, and then they experience violence from an adult child later on in life, that those two experiences need to be taken into context when they're being provided with service, and that their understanding of abuse, their understanding of the resources available, that those all relate often to age as well. An intersectional approach recognizes the intersections of identities and impacts of those intersections of identities within a survivor's life, as well as within the life of a system or a service or an individual worker who is providing that support, and how their specific identities, racialized women, for example, women who have survived residential schools, LGBTQ2SI plus women, looking at someone who might be experiencing barriers related to settlement, who's recently immigrated or is a refugee. Those pieces are very key in understanding how someone's experiencing gender-based violence and also what the path might be to safety. So in our work, we have focused on older women specifically. We did a project called Aging Without Violence, and those resources are available on our website, oath.ca. And we focused on older women specifically in that project for a number of reasons. One of them is we know Ontario has an aging population, and we will be increasing the numbers, projected numbers of older women are really growing at an exponential rate. And we know that older women experience violence differently than their younger counterparts. We also know they might have additional barriers to accessing services. We know they might be more likely to be financially dependent on the person who's using them. We know that for someone who has an identity that's impacting that experience of services and experience of the violence, the experience of community support, all of those pieces are integral puzzle pieces to understand. And also the unique impacts of complex trauma, that trauma across the lifespan. That might include sexual violence, which has very unique implications and impacts for older women compared to their younger counterparts. We also know older women, there might be a barrier with different attitudes and understanding of abuse in relationships, and a distrust of services. And older trans women, and non-binary and gender diverse older adults, it's important to understand that many of those barriers are shared as well, and the services are available. So some of the warning signs, this would be in general that they might be experiencing, some type of gender-based violence, would be changes in behavior, especially social. So that would be someone who, was getting out of the house or wherever they're living, where they were, in other spaces, and now that's not happening as much. It might be that they seem really fearful. They might have physical health problems that seem to have recently been exacerbated, or their chronic pain. Maybe their mobility has really decreased, physical injuries, financial changes. So part of that might be who's in control. Part of financial abuse might be not having control of the money, or it might be having to have all of the responsibility. So also bills not being paid, not being able to finance things that previously, or afford things that previously were feasible, lack of food in the home, lack of access to medication and other essential resources. And that might include assistive devices. So we always recommend that when there's safety planning relating to gender-based violence, that there is consideration of assistive devices. That might include in an emergency escape kit, including something like an extra hearing aid, which would allow someone to utilize that if they had to leave quickly and the aggressor had somehow removed the assistive device, in this example, the hearing aid, and they were no longer able to access it. Lack of information about property ownership or the finances. And caregiver stress is a warning sign, but typically for gender-based violence, that would be in combination with some of the other warning signs that are listed here or that aren't listed. When we look at what are the unique barriers in connecting and really meaningfully engaging with services, whether that's healthcare services, violence against women, gender-based violence services, any kind of social service. We know that there might be barriers that are shared with their younger counterparts, but also unique ones. For example, the compound impacts of violence, that risk from multiple perpetrators. The physical signs might be attributed, oh, that's due to aging. We already know that they have arthritis. However, that might not actually be the root cause, or it's only contributing. A fear of a loss of autonomy, and that might be, specifically related to threats of, by the aggressor of being placed into a long-term care facility. And particularly in cases where the aggressor is the power of attorney, that can be very difficult for that person to seek safety and be able to engage services. That distrust of services, that might be based on a history of service use where there were different best practices and different barriers or biases that they experienced from staff of a specific service. An example of that would be an older trans woman who doesn't go to emergency rooms because they have experienced quite a bit of, outright discrimination, microaggressions, and general, lack of good service that perhaps was from 20 years ago, and they've avoided emergency rooms until then. Length of abuse and violence, that violence might have been occurring for quite some time. In cases of, an older woman who's experiencing violence from a partner, they might have been married for 40 years. So it's a different thing than talking with someone who has been in a relationship for several years. Isolation within isolation, so older adults are already isolated. We've got, 2SL, LGBTQ, 2SI, those relationships or those communities, there can already be that isolation of individuals within that community. So then we have that other layer of isolation of surviving gender-based violence and the shame and the stigma. So that can be very limiting to connecting and even knowing about resources, not having transportation or the resources to connect. That might just mean data on their cell phone, for example. Mobility and physical health concerns. Sometimes if the aggressor has a degenerative disease, that might be dementia, for example, some form of dementia. There's an assumption that all of those behaviors are coming from that degenerative disease and not perhaps rooted within power and control issues within that relationship. A lack of knowledge, and sometimes, especially in a rural or northern remote community, it might be that the resources are just simply not available. That caregiver to the abuser or the aggressor, if they are in a caregiving role, that's a specific barrier. Or if they raised the person who's hurting them, there's a specific, often feeling of responsibility there. An invisibility of violence against older women outside the scope of elder abuse, which is part of why we like to really make sure that we're including that in the scope of gender-based violence. And that capacity around technology-based services. Evidence does show that there is capacity, but sometimes it might be a capacity issue. Sometimes, even though some older women have good technology-based capacity, others might have issues with it. They might have issues with those connectivity pieces, as I mentioned, for example, Wi-Fi, data access. And the reality of shelter spaces, not always being accessible spaces, and not always being age-friendly spaces. That often violence against women shelters are very focused on the needs of younger women. That's something that we've definitely, done some work around and trying to increase capacity there. Being very loud and busy spaces sometimes, especially with young children. These are some of the high risk factors that have been identified for lethality, for death. So that's also referred to as femicide, which we'll talk about in a moment. And some of those are listed within the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee when they do an inquest. The Be Safer is a tool developed in British Columbia by Randy Kropp, and also the danger assessment developed by Jackie Campbell. And part of that is the history of domestic violence and stressing factors to the situation. For example, separation, unemployment, somebody getting a new partner, the survivor or the aggressor finding out that their survivor has a new partner, that obsessive, jealous behavior, depression, drug and alcohol use, and definitely threats to kill, that increase in severity, strangulation, sexual violence. Those are all risk factors commonly identified even by different tools. So femicide describes the intentional killing of women, children, or other gender diverse individuals by men. We do track femicides. We've been doing that since 1990. You can find that information on our website. And we have a femicide report that comes out every year, a femicide list, and we've also been doing monthly reports. And we can see the increase has been consistent in the numbers of older women that are being killed. So 36% of the women on our last year's femicide list were over 55, which was 40% in the previous years. And we know that the most likely perpetrators in these cases are family members, partners, and other known and unknown relationships. And they're also likely to be younger than the victim. That might be in a relationship, for example, where that is a son or grandson, or a neighbor. Characteristics of older women femicides developed by the DVDRC, the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, intact marriages, depression within the perpetrator, dementia within the victim, the spouse is a caregiver, and also that there's often a higher number of warning signs than in cases involving younger victims. So when we're talking to someone that we're concerned about, asking, are you experiencing domestic violence? Does he hit you? Are you being abused? They don't often get good results because they're making a lot of assumptions about what that person knows, how the language that they use, if they see what they're experiencing as abuse. So these are just some suggestions, asking about if they're fearful, what do things look like when they're at their worst, asking how they've been sleeping. Those are some suggestions of finding out what's happening if you're concerned. Also making sure that you're taking time, that you're starting from a place of safety, you're focused on the survivor, you're in a place where she feels comfortable and confidential, and you're really noting what the warning signs are that you're concerned about. So the example at the bottom, Jean, I'm worried about you. You seem to be in more pain than usual lately, and I've also noticed you seem anxious. I want you to know I'm here for you if you'd like to talk about anything. So keeping the door open, recognizing that it's a process, not a one-time thing to connect someone with help or to be that source of safety, and really, keeping your conversation with them very much focused on what they'd like to see and what their goals are. So just a few tips, ending off on taking action. Most communities in Ontario have an elder abuse network and a violence against women coordinating committee. I really encourage you to connect with those committees, to sit on those committees, to represent as a community member, as an older adult, as a service provider. And they're great resources for developing tools and also disrupting that kind of siloed services and just increasing collaboration. Ensuring you know what local and provincial resources are available. You can follow We Count Femicide Because on Twitter. And you can also speak to your local leaders about how they're prioritizing gender-based violence against older women. Just some of the services we spoke about earlier, Shelter Safe, you can find a shelter. Sexual assault support.ca, you can find a sexual assault center. SADBtreatmentcenters.ca, you can find an SADB treatment center, which can provide support and evidence collection following a sexual assault or a physical assault. And if you go to awake.ca, we've got a lot of the resources that I spoke about today. We have Word to the Wise fact sheets focused on older women, and we have a section, excuse me, of the website that's just focused entirely on older women, as well as a few courses in our training portal that are focused on older women and gender-based violence. Elder Abuse Ontario, the Senior Safety Line, and Assaulted Women's Helpline are also great resources for further information or to link clients with. And there is my contact information. I can be reached at amber@awaith.ca. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to see all the work that we're doing related to older women and beyond. And I really thank you for your time today and for MCIS for having me.
Thank you so much, Amber. Let me see, I think we have, here we are. We've received some questions. So I'm going to read out the first one. You've mentioned a higher number of signs of femicide for older women compared to younger women. Can you say more about that, please?
Absolutely. So I'm going to go back to that slide. When we look at those lists of the warning signs, Peter Jaffe, particularly in his research, and a lot of that work would be around the DVDRC, what he's noticed, and you can search him and look up some of his full presentations, is that there's often more of those warning signs. So there's more of them present when they look at a situation that's ended in femicide and they kind of get all of the puzzle pieces afterwards. So for example, in a situation that involved younger counterparts, it might be that there were only 3 or 4 of the risk factors, but then they look at situations where, those that we're seeing here, but then we look at situations where there were risk factors, warning signs, and it was a case of older adults, an older woman being killed, and there might be 7 or more of the warning signs. So don't quote me on the 7. I don't have his slides up in front of me, but I'm pretty sure that that's his most recent research in regards to the number of warning signs. So part of that is, just the difference of the context of their connection with the community and different elements of those situations. Oh, and I see another one here. How are cases of abuse of older women typically discovered? Through physicians, friends, service providers, or in some other way? So, yeah, that's a good question. I think healthcare is a really integral partner when it comes to recognizing that there might be a problem. They're also really key to identifying the high risk factors as well as connecting with service. If you look at some of the research, for example, Jackie Campbell, that her risk factors here under DA on this slide, when they look at those cases of women who were killed, most of them did not have any connection with the Violence Against Women Service or Shelter the year prior to their death, but almost all of them had a connection with the healthcare service. Because even if it's something where you're isolated at home, or it's something where you're not able, that aggressor is controlling your access to friends and family, there might still be access to healthcare. So there definitely is a high amount of opportunity, I think, in, to use your language, discovering, and that disclosure from older women and sharing that something's happening. I think that can occur and does occur most often with friends and family. So the service providers can provide assistance, but typically there needs to be a bridge to that assistance. So that bridge might be a trusted physician or a nurse practitioner, or perhaps an allied healthcare professional, such as a personal support worker that comes into the home and provides some type of service. But very, very often, especially when we look at older women, it's the friends and the family member, someone they volunteer with, or an adult child, a neighbor. That might be someone that really is in a position to see these warning signs, and that they start that conversation, which results in them learning more and hearing that, yes, there is different types of abuse occurring, or whatever that is.
Thank you, Amber, so much for leading this important conversation. This was really fantastic. I learned a lot, and I think it was such a great learning experience for everyone. And to all our participants, thank you so much for attending. I hope you have a wonderful week, and we will see you next time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.